Hey Peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is the long-awaited Butterick 6018 sew-along. So my Patreon peeps voted for this as the sew-along I think last August, and then things happened. But here we are in a dress that I absolutely love. And it's a bit different for me because it's a solid colour, which, I mean, it's my favourite colour, but it's not a pattern, which is a little bit of a shock to see. I absolutely love this. I really like the shape of it. I like the detail on the neck here. I like that it's built up around the back of the neck, which I think is a really nice feature. It has two necklines, so there's this sweetheart one, or there is one with a lapel, like a collar that goes back. I haven't made that yet, but I can see myself making it in the future, and if I do, I will add the details of how I make that to this sew-alongs playlist. So for now, we're going to be talking about this particular dress and how I made it. Today we're going to be going over finding your size, tracing the pattern, altering the pattern for your requirements, making a muslin, altering the pattern again, and getting your fabric cut out. So let's get started. You will need pattern, fabric, matching thread, marking tool, scissors, more scissors, pins, bias binding, French curve, seam ripper, ask me how I know, sewing machine, iron, ironing board. You're also going to need tracing paper and a pencil. Tracing paper is way too heavy to put on this ironing board, it would collapse. The very first thing you want to do is iron your pattern pieces, because that will give you a nice surface to trace from. And yes, I do trace my patterns because they're expensive over here in the UK and I don't want to have to buy it again. And if it goes out of print and I end up needing a larger or smaller size, I will be upset. And I need to make quite a few alterations to my patterns, so I want to be able to do that on slightly sturdier paper than this tissue paper. I like both of these varieties of dresses, so I'm going to trace out all of the pieces. But for example, if you particularly like dress A and that's what you want to make, then you're going to want to go through this list here and pick out all the pieces that are for dress A. So you'd need 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So you'd need all of those pieces. But I, as I say, like both of these styles and can see myself making both of them. So I'm going to just get it all out and done with in one go. The other thing that you want to do is have a look at the finished pattern measurements, which you will find on the tissue paper, not anywhere else, annoyingly. I have the pattern envelope here and I've got the size 6 to 14 bundle. I do have the larger size as well. Mum wants to make this dress, so I do have it available if I need it. But if I was going by the measurements on the back of the envelope, I would need a size 16 bust, a size 12 waist and a size 18 hip. Now the hip I'm not going to worry about too much because it is very free over the hips, so as long as it fits in the bust and the waist, I think it's going to look all right. But so it was a size 16 bust, which is not, this pattern bundle doesn't go up that far, but the finished measurements for the size 14 are 39.5 inches. The size 14 on the pattern envelope is a 36, so they've got 3.5 inches of wearing ease built into this, and for me that's quite a lot of wearing ease for a fitted dress. I think if you made it with their recommendations, you wouldn't end up with a fitted dress that looks like this. It would be a lot baggier, which is not what I want. So I'm actually going to go for the size 14 at the bust. The waist measurements are on pattern piece 9, and for this one I'm going to go for the size 10. And yeah, so that it says I should go for the size 12, and the size 12 is a 28.5 inch finished measurement, so that's 2.5 inches of wearing ease. I might actually go for the 12 and take it in a little bit, possibly. I'm not sure yet. It's going to either be the 10 or the 12. The 10 will be a very snug fit, which is something that I do like, but the 12 will be a little bit more wearing ease. I think I probably will go for the 10. Yeah, I think I'm going to go for the 10. That'll give me an inch of wearing ease. Now I need to trace out all of my pattern pieces, which is going to be fun. The only other deviation that I'm going to make from the pattern is you can see here, this actually has a side zip, which I hate with a passion. I hate side zips. I find them incredibly difficult to get in and out of. They irritate me massively. So what I'm going to do, there is a back seam on the skirt. I'm actually going to put a back seam in the back of the bodice as well. I am then going to start my zip from around about here. So it's going to zip from there down to about here rather than right up to the neckline. So I won't need to adjust the facing because the facing will be fine. I will need to add in seam allowance to the back portion so that I can add in a back seam here. And my sister-in-law's wedding dress, which is a Vogue dress, had a zip that started lower like this and down to there, and it made it very easy to get in and out of, but it was also quite nice finish as well around the neckline, and it won't interrupt the collar or anything on the neckline. So that's my plan for tracing out the pattern, and obviously I will show you that as I go. It's very easy. We have the back bodice piece here and it says cut on the fold, so rather than cut on the fold we just need to add the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to this piece. I'm going to get everything traced out. Wish me luck. There are how many pieces? 12 pieces. The tracing paper I use is from a company called Moreplan, and I buy the 300 meter rolls, which is around £75, but they last me about 3-4 years. The cost per meter is very, very low. However, it is not the easiest thing to see through. It is doable, but there is something called Swedish tracing paper, which is much easier to see through. So I find this stuff okay to work with. Mum hates it, which is why she buys Swedish tracing paper, but Swedish tracing paper is around about £15 for 10 meters, so it's much more expensive. But then if you don't trace out as many patterns as I do, it's, you know, you make your own decisions. My trick for making it a little bit easier to do, especially on a very dark background like this, is put down a layer of the paper and then put the pattern piece on top, and then put my paper over the top. So as you can see, it is see-through. You can see what you're doing. It is just a little bit, you have to concentrate a little bit more than if you had Swedish tracing paper. I'm gonna get everything traced out. Okay, so I'm gonna make some alterations to this pattern. I have to make this standard alteration to every single pattern that I ever make because I have a long torso, so I'm going to need to lengthen the bodice by about an inch. The lengthen and shorten lines are on the pattern. I've traced them out. They're just above the waistline, so I'm going to lengthen them there by an inch. And that is actually the only alteration that I need to do to this pattern, which is great. So I'm going to get on and get that done. I have done a video about how to do this separately, which you can find here, but I'll show you really quickly in this video as well. First things you're going to need are some paper scissors, sellotape, straight edge. I'm using the straight edge of my French curve, and a pencil. So the first thing I want to do is draw a rectangle the amount that I would like to lengthen my pattern piece by, and for me, as I say, that is an inch. That's a pretty standard alteration that I need to make it to any Butterick, Vogue and McCall's pattern that I have come across so far. I've not really ever had to add much more than that, so I feel pretty confident doing that. The next thing you want to do is draw a perpendicular line to those lines. So this is your reference point. We're going to take our pattern piece, and we've got the lengthen and shorten lines were on the pattern. I've traced them out, they were just above the waist. And the thing that you want to make sure with this one is that you have a straight line that's also going perpendicular through those lengthen and shorten lines. So in this case it's the grain line. If you don't have one of those lines going through it, you can draw it in yourself. It doesn't need to be anything specific, just needs to be perpendicular and at a right angle to the lengthen and shorten line, because that's going to be where you match up your pattern pieces. So I'm going to cut along the lengthen and shorten line. So I'm going to line up that new cut edge with the bottom of my 1 inch rectangle that I have drawn on this scrap piece of paper, and I also want to line up the reference mark that I made on the paper with the reference mark that I have on my pattern piece, and tape that down. And then with the top part of the pattern, you want to line the cut edge up with the 1 inch mark that you made, and then you also want to line up the perpendicular reference mark that you put through. So for me it was just it's the grain line on this pattern, so that just makes sure that everything lines up where it should. So the next thing you need to do is fill in the gaps. So again, I'm using my French curve. This side there isn't really much of a curve to it, so I'm just going to use a straight edge. This one there is a little bit of a curve, so I'm just going to try and find the place on my French curve that matches up the best and put in that line. So we've ended up adding in an inch of length to the pattern piece. Now you just need to cut it out and repeat the process in all the other pattern pieces. Cut out the new pattern piece and I have an inch of length added to the torso just above the waist, which is where I need it. So as I say, I'm going to repeat that process on all the other skirt panels which have the lengthen and shorten line on them, and then we're done with our pattern. We can start cutting out some fabric. So I've made my muslin of the bodice, and I've made it in the fabric that I'm using because I have enough to do that, and I have decided that this seems really kind of pointless, this front seam, because I can get this neckline by cutting on the fold and just being very careful with how I sew. And also I just really dislike facings, and I dislike wearing things with facings, so I've decided not to carry on with this one but treat this as a muslin. As I mentioned, I think I've mentioned before, it was about 5/8 of an inch too short because I tried it on as is and this was sitting exactly where I wanted it to, and obviously this, once I've taken the seam allowance out, that won't be the case. So I've added that to the bodice and recut the bodice out. So having made the bodice as is, I've decided that I need to add 5/8 of an inch length to the bodice pieces for them to sit where I would like them to sit on my body, and I've decided to do that just under the dart because that goes the whole way across nicely to the front, which is where I want to add the length, is to this part here, and it means that I'm only going to be changing this dart a tiny little bit, and I'm going to do the same to the back. And the way I found the placement for the back line was by matching up the edge here and then just making a little mark where these two met, and then drawing a straight line the whole way across using this as my right angle. And I've made exactly the same line on the bodice with the lapel, and I did that by laying the bodice over the curved or the sweetheart neckline one and just tracing that line because it's exactly the same, it's just got a different neckline. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this so it's cut on the fold. When I was sewing this, it was the most difficult part of the bodice was getting these points to meet up nicely with no hole in them. The other thing that I'm going to do as well is I don't like facings. I made my muslin with a facing and I just don't like it. I don't like how it looks, so I'm going to entirely line the entire bodice. The other view with the lapel, that will have a facing because I believe that would work. I mean, you could definitely do that as a lining as well. You could use a contrast fabric so that when the lapel folds back, the contrast fabric would be on show. But for this one, I do think a facing is possible. But again, as I say, you could just cut the whole thing out in your lining fabric and line it, just bearing in mind that the lapel, when it's turned back, will be visible. So the front, at least the front lining, needs to be either the same fabric or the contrast fabric that you want to use. I am going to cut myself one of these and one of these out of lining after I've added the 5/8 of an inch extra length in the bodice that I need. I'm going to do that in exactly the same way as I've done everything else. Make sure there's a perpendicular line in there, use that as my reference point, stick it down, true up the edges, and job's done. This is future Shan. I've managed to lose the clip where I showed you this part, but I decided that I didn't want to cut this bodice as two pieces and seam it together. I wanted to cut it on the fold, so I marked the seam allowance in, which is 5/8 of an inch, and I just folded that over. I've not cut it off of this one because I'm not ruling out the possibility of actually doing the centre front seam and adding buttons to it in the future, but I wanted to, as I say, this time be able to cut it on the fold. I just marked the seam allowance in and then folded it under and cut it with this edge up against the fold of the fabric. Even though I'm not going to be using the facing pieces, I will still want to have some interfacing around this neckline to help it all sit in nicely and stay nice and crisp. So I have just measured an inch away from the pattern edge here, which my seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, so that will give me a little bit of structure in the stitching line on the lining piece of the front bodice, and that's what I'm going to use this for. I'm just going to cut off this excess because, as I say, I'm never going to use this facing. I don't like wearing dresses with facings in, so you know, that personal preference. So I'm going to cut this off and then cut this piece out of interfacing and secure it to the bodice, which I will of course show you. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I will see you again very soon. Bye!